It hits the table. I do it too. It's just so irresistible.
I've just done 58 podcasts, so
You know better.
so I just don't do that. I'll probably do it now, just like you might
Exactly.
call me Justice Lauten.
All right, and we're live.
Andrae Bailey here on Change Everything Live. I'm supposed to look at this camera. Okay, Andrae Bailey here with Change Everything Live with here Chief Judge Fred Lauten, 9th District of Florida.
Judicial Circuit.
See, I knew I was going to mess this up.
That's all right.
9th Judicial Circuit. Because I almost called you the Chief Justice.
Please don't do that.
Yeah, well, you know
because
how
there's one Chief Justice in Florida in Tallahassee.
So you know how this is. As soon as I've never done that before. I've never called you the Chief Justice.
You never have.
But as soon as you told me, don't call me the Chief Justice,
That's right.
I now have it in my head, and I'll avoid that. Again, Change Everything Live. We are live on YouTube right now, but we're also on CBS, so on Saturday nights. If you're watching this on CBS, you can watch the entirety of our interview on Apple iTunes, or you can see this broadcast that was on YouTube in its full form. Judge, how's it going? What's going on in the world of criminal justice?
Well, there's a lot that's going on in I think both locally, regionally, statewide, and nationally. So there are lots of conversations about criminal justice reform. I think we'll get into a few of those: sentencing reform, pretrial release reform, diversity on the bench. There's lots of topics that are important and getting a lot of conversation about the criminal justice system.
You know, when we were talking about having you on, and we were trying to think of, what's the most interesting topic when it comes to criminal justice or being a judge, a chief judge. What I hear from people all the time when you get in a conversation about, our criminal justice system, our jails, is just how many people in the United States of America that are in prison or in jail. I think we were looking up the number, and the number we saw online, it needs to be validated, but we saw 2.2 million people, roughly in 2013. I'm not sure what that number is now, were in jail. Another 4.7 million on probation. So that means incarcerated is 1 out of 100 Americans, right. The largest amount of people jailed, incarcerated, of any country in the world. I think we incarcerate more people than North Korea. I think that's...
Well, yeah, that doesn't surprise me, because if you're probably terrified to step out of line in North Korea because you'll just get executed or disappear.
Yeah, so you made a very interesting point to me. You said, Andrae, I agree, the stats say that we incarcerate more people in America than any country in the world. But that might be a little misleading, because in other societies, totalitarian societies, you're not even going to get a fair trial.
Right, yeah. I mean, in a really repressive totalitarian society, North Korea, parts of Russia, due process is they don't even have the concept of due process. You step out of line in North Korea, and the leadership there will just take you out. And so, the president executed his uncle, and the joke was because he didn't applaud enough at one of his speeches. And so we have an open democratic society. We're governed by a rule of laws. We have 350 million people. We incarcerate a lot of people, and there's a real debate about, do we incarcerate too many people? But we're also a society that tolerates a little bit more and then puts you through a process where rights are afforded to you before you're incarcerated. But we do incarcerate a lot of people. And Andrae, the big discussion now is, and it goes back to the 80s and 90s, have we imprisoned way too many people because of their use of drugs or sale of some amount of drugs, and their trafficking in drugs? And not too many people have much sympathy for drug traffickers. Someone saying, I'm going to make my living off of the misery of other people who are addicted to drugs and who might die. I don't care, because I'm just making profit. Nobody's really too sorry. But what about people who are just using or selling amounts in order to support a habit, who are addicted, who are diseased? Should we really be locking them up, or should we be treating them? And that's a big conversation in the criminal justice world today.
And as a judge, you've always told me, I've known you quite a few years, you have to be careful because you're not a policymaker. Your job is not to make laws.
That's right.
Your job as a judge and as the chief judge is to oversee the implementation of our community, our states, our federal laws as applicable. But what you're saying is we incarcerate a lot of people in this country, and all of us know that, and it's a statistical fact. And maybe we incarcerate folks that in other countries would be put to death, would get no due process, and incarceration, although not the best outcome for their life, shows that we have a society that has the rule of law.
Right.
But we might also have to look at who is in our prison system.
Right.
And when you look in our prison system, I am not an expert on this. I'm just like everyone else that talks to you. I'm just someone who wonders about these things. I would look at our prison system and say, we got a lot of people who are in jail for low-level drug offenses. We have a lot of minorities who are in jail who are disproportionately in jail versus their percentage of population. And we have a lot of people who are socioeconomically challenged who wind up seemingly, this is just, again, I'm speaking as a novice, seemingly winding up incarcerated at higher rates than people who are more affluent. So those, I think those are the stereotypes the average person has. How do you see that when you're on the bench?
Well, I mean, I think all of that is true.
So those are statistical truths.
I don't think you can legitimately debate why are minorities in the prison population, whether federally or in state court, in much greater numbers than they appear in the population at large.
It's just a fact that that's the way it is.
I don't know how you debate that because the numbers would undermine your argument. You know, why is that? Is it because of racist policing? Is it because of poverty and poverty-driven crime? Is it because of over-policing in a neighborhood so that the police respond more often and more frequently and make more stops in a minority neighborhood than they would make in a majority neighborhood? And it's worth asking all of those questions and trying to find out the answers to those questions. When I sentence an individual in a court, I'm guided by a sentencing guidelines score sheet that gives me a number and tells me within a range things that I have to do. And when I sentence an individual, it would be out of place for me to say, I want to talk about the overall incarceration policy in the United States because of this one person. I'm dealing with one person. I'm often dealing with a victim of a crime who was harmed by this person, if it's a crime of violence or theft that harms someone, and so I'm sentencing that individual person. But someone, policymakers, but not just policymakers, I think more and more they want to hear from us, understanding I'm not a policymaker, but they want to hear from the judges about what's happening in the criminal justice system. Where are we? Is it fair? Is it unfair? Do we need to make adjustments? And so these are conversations that I hear a lot and I engage in a lot, and they're great conversations to have. I should have them, and policymakers should have them too. So, you know, President Clinton now talks about, was he and his attorney general a little too tough and strict about mandatory minimum sentencing in federal court for crack cocaine possession? Did it discriminate in minority communities because there was a greater use of crack?
Was that the three strikes law?
No, that's the different law.
Okay.
This was sort of federal sentencing guidelines where you could go to prison for crack cocaine and you know, you'd be there as easily as you would be for large amounts of powder cocaine. And there was sort of more uses of crack cocaine in minority communities because of its affordability than powder cocaine. And so lots of blacks were going to prison because it was the predominant drug in the community. And the other interesting issue that you and I are involved in right now is there is clearly a nation, state, region, local concern about opioid addiction.
Everywhere.
But a lot of members in the community go, where was that concern when minority members of our community were dying from crack cocaine? Where were the task force about crack cocaine and its deaths in our community? And now that opioids have affected white people, there are, and so my response to that is maybe we were wrong back then, but today we know better, and so we want to talk about everyone's safety, no matter what community you're in. But that's an interesting conversation that you hear sometimes in our circles.
Yeah, maybe I could encapsulate everything you just said by saying this. The average person out there looks at our criminal justice system in America and goes, this is supposed to be a bedrock of our society, our criminal justice system, our jails. But sometimes it seems like fairness isn't a bedrock of our criminal justice system, and if fairness and equality of sentencing or of decisions made in the criminal justice system isn't there, how do we believe in that system? And listen, I don't know that anyone has the answers, but I think we do have to have some tough conversations about it. You know, if I were to whiteboard out, this criminal justice conversation, as you just articulated it, we've got a lot of people who are minorities in jail. We need to have an answer as a society to, how we can look at that and try to make change on that. You also now have an incredible amount of folks struggling with drug addiction.
Right.
Do you see it both ways? Do you see many folks who use drugs recreationally and they wind up getting in trouble, as well as folks who are addicted? Is that a different group, or most people wind up in your court, they're struggling with addiction? Which one is it?
Well, I see a little bit of everything.
Okay.
So I see mostly people who are involved in drugs directly or peripheral crimes associated with drugs. So they're stealing to get money to buy drugs. So you see a fair amount of that. I see some dealers, and in my career I've seen some racketeers. I mean, some high-level enterprise individuals who are running a drug scheme or running the heroin market on the west side of town. I prosecuted a gentleman for that many years ago in the 1980s who was charged with racketeering, and who basically he ran the whole heroin trade on the west side of town in Orlando. So we kind of see everybody at every level, and so I don't know that there's one portion of the population that shows up more than another.
When you see a drug dealer, someone who is racketeering, smuggling large amounts of heroin or cocaine or whatever a drug it is that they're doing commerce in, do you look at some of these folks and you're like, man, this is a bright, smart person. Sure. Why are they building a criminal empire that almost certainly, statistically, is going to end up with them making money and going to jail? Do you ever look at some of these folks in front of you on the bench, when you're on the bench, and you're like, you just want to shake them and say, go into a legitimate business?
Right. Yes, I've seen people to whom I have said, brother or sister, you are so talented that if you had started your own business, you'd be retired by now. Who knows? I don't know what brought them to kind of a criminal enterprise as opposed to a legitimate enterprise. Adverse childhood experiences growing up, or the wrong influence in high school or college. Who knows? I don't know.
But these are smart people, talented people who decide to do a business that's illegal, and you've got sentencing guidelines that tell you have some flexibility, but if you deal drugs at a certain level, you've got to sentence them.
Yeah, Florida, like many states, has mandatory minimum penalties for quantities of drugs, so there's no discretion. If you sell or traffic in certain levels of offenses of controlled substances and you get convicted, I have no discretion to sentence you. I have to give you mandatory minimums: 3 years, 5 years, 15 years, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. But those are for enterprise offenses. We also sometimes say in our system, what are the really smart criminals getting away with? Because every now and then you see behavior where you think, how did you think that this was not going to result in a bad situation for you? And, we say, I see some people say, if you had put your talents to work in a legitimate enterprise. But also, we've sometimes asked, I wonder what really smart criminals are getting away with.
The people that never wind up in your court system.
You never see. You read about them in, magazines and books sometimes. You go, holy smokes.
Yeah, you...
Andrae,
like who would have...
I'm going to go ahead and butt in right here. Just try not to touch the mic, because every time you do, you'll be jacking up his audio.
Gotcha.
Like, who would have ever thought Bernie Madoff, was defrauding people, and he convinced very smart people to give them their life savings. But that all fell down one day. But for a long time, it was like, wow.
The Bernie Madoffs of this world, the Lou Pearlmans of this world fascinate me, because you have hundreds of millions of dollars already. Like, you're not poor. Right. You're already super mega rich, but it's not enough. Do you
It's a
see?
house of cards.
It's
It
a
just
house of cards.
can't
Bernie
stand.
Madoff, I think he swindled folks out of 5 billion. I mean, it was some
He
incredible number.
swindled, he swindled individuals who were pretty smart.
Yeah.
He swindled state investment agencies who are investing the pension money for state employees. So, like the California pension program invested in Bernie. So he was a super salesman.
You see,
But I didn't see Bernie Madoff.
you didn't.
I
You
just
didn't.
read about him.
But you see these, I'll say Bernie Madoff types from a psychological, from a cultural standpoint, who wind up in front of the criminal justice system, maybe not that much money,
Right, I don't
but
see that much.
but folks who you look at them and you say, gosh, like, what are you doing, man? Like, what a poor choice. Do you counsel people from the bench?
Not
Do you,
too much. Early in my career, I might have lectured people more than I ever do now.
Okay.
It every now and then, and I might lecture someone, but I think it's a little unseemly for the judge to do it. The group that I might talk to heart, are young people who appear in front of me. Maybe it's their first time in felony court, and I'll talk to them about choices and where their future goes, put them on probation and say, you can take your life down this path or this other path. One path leads to a lifetime of incarceration and probation and misery, or learn a lesson from this episode and stop engaging in this behavior. I do that a little bit, but my role isn't to really be the social worker to correct social ills. It's to sentence when I can. Andrae, a lot of people, most people I see are not Bernie Madoff, so I want to be clear about that. Most people are human beings who deserve respect, who do. We should never lose the fact that they're human beings who have gotten themselves in problem situations, and sometimes for understandable motives. They, were born to parents who were addicted to drugs, who were criminals, who abandoned them, who didn't read to them at night, who didn't ever check whether their homework was getting done, who didn't enroll them in sports, and just sort of said, good luck, make it, because I'm not there for you. And then ultimately they end up in front of me. And so I'm dealing with this sort of problem that you could have predicted years ago would likely end up in here. I deal with that a lot more than I deal with a Bernie Madoff who's just a brilliant person who's swindling people.
So the court system, as you see it and as you're articulating it now, is a court system that winds up being a place where those in poverty, those who have challenges in their upbringing, disproportionately are going to wind up in front of judges like you.
I think that we have in the court system a significant percentage of defendants who have mental health issues, who have substance abuse addiction. And if we could solve the homeless, if we could solve the root problem, if we could treat them for their mental health issue, if we could treat their disease of addiction, if we could provide them stable housing and employment and social services, we would significantly reduce the population that appears in front of me. And so that's a lot of what drives. And sometimes it's just people who are psychopathic and want to hurt people and don't care, but that's really not a lot of the individuals we see. Mostly it's people who have problems that you would understand, but then they engage in criminal behavior.
Were you around, were you practicing law when, or were you a judge when the Ted Bundy case was out?
No, but I was a prosecutor.
Okay, you were a prosecutor then.
So I've been in the courtroom that he was in.
So you were in the courtroom where Ted Bundy was, after he was caught?
Well, the courtroom where he was tried here, which is in the historical building now, was the first felony courtroom that I was assigned to, and so his initials were carved into the defense table, so we had TB carved into the table where the defense attorney.
Who carved that in?
He did.
Wait, hold on. Wait a second. So Ted Bundy is caught after all. Did he get caught and escape, or did he have?
Yeah, well, he had escaped more than once from prison, but I don't. It's been a little while, but I believe that he committed, the murders at the sorority at Florida State. Then he murdered Kimberly Leach in Lake County. The Kimberly Leach case was tried in the Orlando courthouse. The venue was moved. The Florida State murders, that trial began in Leon County in Tallahassee, where the murders occurred, that ended up moving to Miami and tried in Miami. So after he was convicted and sentenced to death for the FSU murders, he was tried in Orlando for the murder of Kimberly Leach, who I believe was 12 years old. and he received the death penalty for that case, but he was tried in our court. And that table is in the historical courthouse, and his initials are carved in it. You can go see it.
So Ted Bundy carves his initials in this table while he's in the courtroom.
Yes.
What was it like being in a room with Ted Bundy?
Well, I wasn't in the room with Ted Bundy.
Wasn't in the room. You were a prosecutor during the time he was going through the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I wasn't in that room.
Okay.
But I can tell you this, Andre, that maybe a handful of times in my career I've been in a room with a true psychopath.
Okay.
And that was Ted Bundy, who could care less if he murdered you, and his own instant pleasure superseded human value, human life, human worth. There are not a lot of people like that. I've probably seen 2 or 3 in my career. It's a pretty chilling event. It almost is like the temperature in the room drops a few degrees, and it's a very interesting experience to be around someone who you know or learn later is just truly psychopathic, doesn't care if they harm you, doesn't value you. Everything revolves around their immediate sense of their own value.
Yeah, people throw around those terms, psychopathic or sociopath. They throw those around very casually in our society now. What you're saying is you see a lot of criminals, but the real psychopaths, that's a very rare person that walks in your courtroom.
They're scary as all get out, but I haven't seen a lot of that. I've seen lots. I've tried many murder cases, and taking a human life is just horrible. But a lot of the people that I've seen who've done that were driven there by significant drug addiction, or were running in a gang that burglarized and committed crimes and started kind of feeding, cannibalizing on each other. Sort of this stranger murder where you just pick up someone you don't know and murder them. I've had some of those cases. They're very hard, but they're a bit rare. So people in the community say, is this community safe? And I say, it is. They say, well, I don't feel safe. And I say, well, you want to feel safe right away? I have an instant solution for that. Don't turn on the evening news. And they laugh at me and go, no, I'm a little bit serious, because the news media leads every newscast with the 1, 2, 3, 4 murders in the region. And so there's this disproportionate impression that I'm going to get murdered someday. It's going to happen, but it's really very rare. What people should be a little more concerned about is what's in your medicine cabinet, because if you have opiates in there, that's as dangerous as guns in your community, maybe more so. So as you know, because you were involved in this, in America now, more people die from opiate overdose deaths than automobile accidents and murders combined. And that's a chilling number. In the automobile industry, when people started dying in large numbers because of automobile accidents, the regulatory agency said you'll have seatbelts and you'll have airbags to reduce those deaths. Well, we have more deaths now from opiate overdose deaths than we do from automobile accidents, which is amazing to me.
I think I saw a stat, I'll have to validate this, over 70,000 people died in 2016 of opioid-related overdose deaths.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
But
I want to put that in perspective,
okay,
if you'll let me. 56,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. When you think about it, in 1 year, we've had 14,000 more deaths from opiate overdose deaths than in the Vietnam War. I lived through that area. There were marches on Washington. There were student protests. College campuses were affected. And so you kind of think about those numbers and the perspective that it creates, and it's like, we've got to do something about this.
This opioid crisis is like nothing I think we've seen before, at least in my lifetime, in our society from a number of perspectives. One, as you just articulated, the sheer volume of people that are addicted and dying numerically. There's very few things, maybe nothing that I can think of again in modern American history that rivals that. HIV?
Well, I mean, I think there are 1 or 2 parallels to the AIDS crisis, which was that we were ill-informed and biased and stigmatized AIDS when it first hit. And so people were ashamed to say they had AIDS. We said, oh, it's just a problem in the gay community and it's all a lifestyle choice. And a little bit of it was a lifestyle choice. But we were, I think, uninformed and didn't do a good job about it being a health crisis. And a little bit about that with opioid addiction. It's still stigmatized. It's still don't talk about it publicly, but it's as much a disease as it is criminal behavior.
And think about this. I know this gets talked about all the time, and I think that's part of why people don't really, I think, experience the weight of where I'm going right now. But so with the AIDS crisis, with the HIV crisis, you didn't have a family who profited off of it in a way that you do with the pharmaceutical companies and the Schechler family. I'm probably mispronouncing their name, but I would tell you that, I saw an article yesterday that they're going through their emails from 10 years ago, 15 years ago. This family knew how addictive this drug was, and they owned Purdue Pharmaceuticals. Again, everyone out there knows this story now.
Yeah.
I think that there's something, the story of the opioid crisis, if that's true, if it's true that there's a family that drove this drug to the marketplace, that knew it was addictive, that still was fine with seeing Americans become addicted, that pressured our government to push for more pain medication through having that adopted or reinforced through, I think, the FDA. It's so crazy, that story. I think most of us can't fathom that it could be true, but it does seem, again, I don't know, and
Right.
I know you have to be careful making a verdict here. It seems like that is also incredibly different with the opioid crisis. Could it be that 70,000 people a year are dying because of a man-made epidemic that really started with one family and one company? That's
chilling.
we've never seen anything like that before.
Yeah, that's pretty. Well, the only other analogy I might use to that is the tobacco industry.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some evidence in the tobacco trials that are coming out now that the tobacco executives met at the Waldorf Astoria in the 50s and said, we know that nicotine is addictive and it's harmful, but we're going to pay scientists to write reports to say that it's not, and they consciously conspired to addict America to tobacco, and they were pretty successful. That made a lot of money. Now, fast forward 40, 50 years later, they're entering into settlements for billions of dollars with attorney generals, and there are lawsuits over tobacco liability, and we handle those. So that might be analogous to it. It's so multifaceted and it's difficult. So yes, you have the profit motive for pharmaceutical companies. You have doctors who I understand would, in 20 years ago, were told that pain is the fifth vital sign when you diagnose your patient. So you want to know, about their blood pressure, and you want to know about their heart condition, but you also want to know if they're in pain. And then it would be sort of sadistic if you were a doctor who said, well, Andrae, you're my patient, but I don't care that you're in pain. To suck it up and deal with it. So I think doctors wanted to alleviate pain. They were told that these drugs would do so and were not addictive. So you can kind of understand that. I'm a little concerned if the doctors were receiving kickbacks, like, we'll take you to dinner, we'll send you on vacations, you can go to the Bahamas if you'll just prescribe our drugs. There are some allegations about that. So there was that. There were the pill mills, which were shut down in our state. Probably a good thing. The unintended consequences is people went to the street when they couldn't buy OxyContin or oxycodone at a pill mill, and they bought heroin to relieve their pain, and that heroin now is laced with fentanyl, and that's a deadly mixture. It's very complicated, as you know, and it's going to take a lot of work to solve the problem.
It seems that it seems like one of those issues that's almost, again, just hard to put your head around, hard to fathom. Just the amount of people losing their life. And as you said earlier, we've seen other epidemics. The crack cocaine was an epidemic. But I think the difference between this particular issue, opioids, and now heroin and fentanyl and carfentanil. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I still get confused on which one is which, but
I can tell you, but you've got them both.
Okay, they'll both kill you. That's probably
well. Fentanyl has been prescribed before. So I have a friend who had back surgery and was given a fentanyl patch, a slow release dosage of fentanyl to alleviate pain. No one gets prescribed carfentanil.
Okay.
Carfentanil is an elephant tranquilizer.
Okay.
It's made mostly in China. It's made a little bit in Mexico. 2 or 3 grains of carfentanil could be fatal. It takes a little bit more of that from fentanyl to be fatal. So fentanyl is about 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin, which is morphine-based. And carfentanil is about 100 times more potent than fentanyl. So you have this multiplier effect. I entered an administrative order in the courts because every now and then in a drug trial, the state has to bring the drugs into court, and if they're tested by the lab and the lab said there's fentanyl or carfentanil, you bring that substance into the courtroom, the lawyers start handing it to jurors, to the clerk, to the witness to look at. Well, if it's carfentanil, that could be deadly. If it's fentanyl, you could get very sick. And so I entered an administrative order that before you bring that stuff into the courthouse, you have to have a hearing pre-trial. And let's talk about how are we going to handle this evidence. Never had to do that before.
Why do you have to bring the drugs in the courtroom?
Because with the exception of marijuana, there's case law in Florida that if you charge someone with possession of cocaine, possession of heroin, and then the drugs exist, that is they weren't consumed in testing, you are required to introduce them into evidence.
Why?
That's just the law.
It's interesting.
You have to kind of confront the witness with the evidence of their crime that exists.
Bring a big bag of cocaine into the...
Oh, I tried, when I was a prosecutor, I tried a case where someone sold 100,000 Quaaludes, and they came in 10 bags of 10,000 Quaaludes each.
They brought in 10 bags of Quaaludes.
Well, but it was in a box.
Okay, and you're into the courtroom.
Well, here's the funny story from that. So we're in the courtroom, so I admit them into evidence and have the agent look at them and say, yeah, those are the Quaaludes that we bought from the defendant who was charged with trafficking. The defense attorney wanted to make a point I never quite got, but he went over to the evidence for cross-examination and he said to the clerk, can I see that exhibit? And he picked up one of the smaller bags and he picked it up to pull it out of the box, and when he got it about shoulder high, the bottom broke open. And 10,000 Quaaludes went flying all over the courtroom. And we had to stop the trial.
that is funny.
Collect 10,000 Quaaludes and get back to work.
That seems a little archaic, though, that you have to bring the drugs in.
Today, well, I can tell you what's happening a lot with opioids now. So we have this pretrial hearing. The defense is entitled to test the substance with their own expert. They sometimes ask for that.
That's what it is.
Pretty rare. So now they'll usually say, you can take a photograph and admit that into evidence, or the lab report, as long as you bring the chemist in so I can cross-examine them as to how did you test these drugs and what machine did you use and what methodology did you use. They're not demanding that the drugs come into evidence. If they demanded that the drugs come in with carfentanil, the prosecutor would say, that's fine, Judge, can I present my case in a hazmat suit? That would have an impact on the jury. And so, we just have never gotten to that sort of absurdity.
So you have drug dealers out there who are dealing in, obviously, heroin, but they're dealing in fentanyl and carfentanil.
I haven't seen a lot of carfentanil personally. I mean, I hear the stories, and I know that it exists and it's out there.
But a lot of fentanyl. You're seeing a lot of dealers dealing in heroin and fentanyl.
Yeah,
and
mixtures
fentanyl,
of fentanyl.
And
cocaine and fentanyl, heroin and fentanyl.
And fentanyl can kill you can be very deadly.
Absolutely.
Do you think these dealers know what they're putting in these drugs? Do you think...
I don't know. Someone along the chain knows because they're mixing it in. So I just don't know who knows. I don't know if this, individual dealer is aware that this is a mixture that contains fentanyl or not. Might be.
Okay.
Might have mixed it themselves.
Different question. Do you think these dealers know how deadly fentanyl is to those that are taking it?
Well, I think if you're paying attention today, you know.
Your clients... There's not many businesses where you supply your client a product and they don't come back at some point and they're dead. So some of these drug dealers, they'd have to notice that the people that they're dealing these drugs to, many of them die. And so do they know how deadly these drugs are?
I think if you knowingly sell a mixture with fentanyl and it results in death, so I think you can be charged now with homicide or manslaughter. So, one thing, and you and I talked about this once before, you'd think, if you just read the paper now, you listen to the news, if you're sort of engaged in social media or anywhere, you probably know that if I buy street drugs, this is highly risky. Just like 20 years ago, if you engaged in unprotected sex in a certain community, your odds of contracting AIDS were much greater. But I asked an addictions doctor, an MD, who specialized in this, who worked at Rikers, who works in New York. She's done 20 years of addictions work. I said, why would people go out on the street and buy drugs knowing how risky it is? And she said, I want you to imagine the worst flu symptoms you've ever had. So think of the worst flu you've ever had. And we've probably all had flus where we think, I can't get out of bed, I can't move, my muscles ache. Multiply that times 10. And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't imagine that. And she says, now, understand that if you buy this substance and it's not deadly, you'll immediately feel better.
Wow.
You inject it into your body, symptoms are gone. And she says, it is that kind of craving that you're dealing with in a human being. And also the brain has been rewired. It's not wired like your brain is or my brain is now. Our chemical receptors are just different. And so people will engage in risky behavior because they need an immediate fix for their craving, their illness, which is very, very powerful. And so, as you know now, to go into treatment and recovery for opioids, the approach today is to provide medicine that is a substitute for deadly medicine. Mm-hmm. So it's not like just go through withdrawal and come out on the other side clean. That's not likely to happen or succeed. And so patients are given Suboxone, and patients are given methadone, and patients are given Vivitrol so that they stay alive while they're going through recovery and through both medicated recovery and therapeutic sessions, group counseling, individual counseling. That's sort of the current model for how do you treat opioid addiction.
Gotcha.
And I'm not an expert. I mean, I know just enough to be dangerous, but I listen to doctors who are experts, and I've heard all of that.
Fred, take 1 second, push this back in your ear.
All right.
All right.
In my ear or behind
Nope,
me?
you just did it. Perfect.
Okay.
What do you think about what do you think about how we've moved in our society towards the court as entertainment on television? I've
That's
seen.
a good question. I like that
well,
question.
I've seen, the last 20, maybe 30 years, and it wasn't the OJ trial that made the court become television. You see now, whether it's Judge Judy, whether it's the different celebrity judges who now preside over criminal justice as theater and entertainment. What do you think about that? Are you a fan of
No.
cameras in the courtroom?
Well, I don't have a problem with cameras in a true courtroom. So I've had cameras in my courtroom, and Florida was sort of a leader in the nation about cameras in the courtroom. We permitted them before a lot of other states, and you still can't take a camera into the federal court. But I am not a fan of pseudo-reality TV in a courtroom. And so I'll tell you a personal story. Marilyn Millian, who's the People's Court judge, and I went to the Judicial College together. We were in the same class.
Okay.
She was a prosecutor in Miami. I was a prosecutor in Orlando.
She took over for Judge Wapner?
She did.
Okay.
Well, I think there was somebody in between, but she eventually became the People's Court judge.
Okay.
Marilyn Millian is exceedingly smart. She's very, very smart. She was a great prosecutor. She was a great judge. She was a county court judge as I was, and then she became a circuit court judge as I did about at the same time. We taught new judges in the college that new judges in Florida go to, and she's brilliant. She had this opportunity, and I don't blame her. She makes 10 to 15 to 20 times what she made in any 1 year and in one season as the People's Court judge. But, her show is driven by ratings, so she does and says things on TV that make me wince. And I go, come on, you would never do that in a Florida court. You'd probably be disciplined if you talk to people that way. So I'm not a fan of these, Judge Judy, People's Court, Judge Matthias, or whatever his name is. I'm not a big fan of this theater for courtroom. On the other hand, actual court cases, so Casey Anthony was broadcast live, O.J. Simpson was broadcast live. I don't have a problem with that. I worry about lawyers playing to the cameras a little bit, but in the actual real trial where there are due process protections and rules, and I'm less concerned, and I don't mind that the public watches a trial. I just don't like reality television. I don't like reality television much about anything anymore, but because I don't think it's so real. But I'm very concerned about it as courtroom. Then there were TV shows like L.A. Law. I liked L.A. Law when I was a lawyer, but it got a little silly after a while. So
You were not the chief judge during the Casey
no,
Anthony trial.
no, my
but
predecessor was.
your predecessor was, but you were a senior leader in this in the judicial community where Casey Anthony was tried. What was it like, the atmosphere around the Casey Anthony trial? What was it like being around that?
That's a great question. Well, it was like nothing we'd ever seen, and it was sort of like nothing we ever expected. So the case started. I remember when it started, and it got a little bit of attention. Mostly local media paid attention to it, and then at some point in time, it was like a switch was thrown in the national media, and all of a sudden, it was in some ways a circus in the sense that the exterior of the courthouse, like the lot across the street, was rented, and there were satellite trucks and booths and anchors and national correspondents showing up in Orlando. That was a little different. Presented real challenges for courtroom security and courtroom admission to watch the thing, and so we had fights outside the courthouse for people wanting tickets to get in to get a seat, and Judge Perry had to manage that. Judge Perry did a great job as the judge of that trial. He was probably the best judge in our circuit to manage that. The circuit judge, who's a really great trial, he was a great trial lawyer, he was a great trial judge and chief judge, and he commanded a courtroom. And so I think he was a great guy to try that case. But you know, I've talked to him a few times about it. It turned him into a personality that he didn't even ask to become, but he would go to airports and people would say, "Yo, Judge Perry," you know, and he'd be in Atlanta or he'd be in Boston. And Jeff Ashton became a celebrity for a while. And so it was kind of unlike anything we ever expected. And it grabbed national attention. There were times when we went, why this case? But we understand some of the aspects that had national attention to it, but those cases are unusual. Sanford had one later in the Trayvon Martin, trial.
That was 18th Circuit?
That was the 18th Circuit,
Okay.
which is right next
But
door.
close enough, that right next to your circuit.
Yeah,
where
George Zimmerman, Trayvon. And so that was a big media case too. And so they come along every now and then. You never know where they're going to be. I've had 3 cases on court TV. I've had murder cases with cameras in my courtroom. I had a husband who murdered his wife, led the search team for her body because he reported her gone and disappeared from Walt Disney World where she worked. And then the police investigated it and arrested him, and he was tried and convicted. And that was on court TV right before a California case that got nationwide attention that was similar. So they sort of ran that right before they ran that case. But that case didn't consume me. I didn't lose all my anonymity that I sort of have. And, you know, I didn't walk down the street and people went, "Yo, Judge Lauten." That didn't happen. But I've had a couple of murder. I had a Naval Academy grad who murdered the ex-husband of his current wife in broad daylight on Highway 50 at Sweet Tomatoes, and that got nationwide coverage, but it wasn't anywhere like the Casey Anthony case.
Now, you did not preside over the Casey Anthony case, but you're in the Ninth Circuit, and you're one of the senior judges. The verdict comes out. You surprised? Or do you pay attention at a level as a judge that you have some opinion on a case like the Casey Anthony case where you go, you know, I think this is going one direction or another. Yeah. Casey Anthony, the media's covering it at this high level. Yeah. She's Googled. How do you,
is the biggest thing we've ever seen.
Asphyxiate your child. You surprised when they find her not guilty?
A couple of things. I didn't watch every minute of that trial. And so I tell people who criticize verdicts, you know, that when I say, well, how did you follow it? Well, I read about it in the newspaper. I saw a clip on evening TV. I said, how long was the clip? 5 minutes. I go, you know, to really, truly appreciate a trial, you have to sit through every minute of it because you're going to miss things that are important. And I didn't sit through every minute of that trial. I wasn't sure how that case was going to go. I thought the most compelling question was, why would a mom not report that her daughter was missing for weeks and weeks and weeks? And I thought that was a hard question for the state to answer. On the other hand, the state asked for the death penalty in a case where there was a question about, did she truly murder her child? And in a lot of death cases, the evidence is very strong that this murder occurred and this person committed the murder, and it's, you know, should they live or should they die as a result of it? So that might have been a tactical error for the prosecution because the case wasn't as strong maybe as the jurors thought it needed to be if you're seeking death. So I wasn't there. I had my own thought about it. I'm going to kind of keep that private. I have learned this, Andrae, that number one, I think jurors, by and large, get decisions correctly. So I've been doing this for 25 years, and most of the time I thought the jurors did a great job. Two, it's not really my job to decide guilt or innocence. I mean, we have a system, we have a jury, they're the fact finder. I don't want to be the fact finder. I'm just happy they're doing that. A couple of times I thought, well, if I were on that jury, I would have seen it differently than you saw it. But I really respect that we bring in people untrained in the law, ordinary citizens. We compel them to come to court. We don't say, you're just invited if you want to come. You'll be there. You get selected. Now go back in this room and make this decision in a format that's a little foreign. Like for years, we wouldn't let them ask any questions. And for years, we wouldn't tell them, here's the rules that you're going to apply to make your decision till the very end of the presentation. So it would be like going to a college course and the professor saying, pay attention to everything I say because I'll tell you later what's important. I'll tell you later what I'm going to ask you about in the exam. I'm not even going to tell you what the exam looks like until we're through with this entire course. And you'd be going, and then, okay, here's what it was that you should have focused on and was important. And here's the jury instructions, which is the test instructions. And you'd be going, I would have liked to have known that at the beginning of this course. So what we ask jurors to do is really pretty tough stuff, and I respect their decision. And I've never publicly criticized the verdict, and I'll never will publicly criticize a verdict that a jury renders.
Only your wife gets to hear those
She
criticisms over a beer.
Yeah, under the oath cone of silence.
Yep. Push that in one more time.
Okay.
So I think about you as a judge. You were around the Casey Anthony trial. It was in your...
I didn't have anything to do with it.
Didn't have anything to do with it, but it was close enough. It was in your circuit that you knew the judges. You still know personally the people who were around that case. You obviously had nothing to do with the O.J. Simpson trial, but you watched it, I'm sure, like everyone else. Where were you? Where were you? You were a judge, or were you a lawyer during the O.J. Simpson trial?
O.J., do you remember what year that was? I think I was...
1995, he got in the Bronco because I remember it was... the NBA Finals were on.
Okay.
And we went from watching the NBA Finals...
To the chase.
That might have been 1994.
Well, if it was after 1993, I was on the bench.
Okay, so that would have been when you were just a judge. But you remember watching the O.J. trial like all of us.
Well, when I could. I was working most of the time.
You're working. But do you think, watching the O.J. Simpson trial, just being in the proximity to big trials or seeing the Casey Anthony trial, do you think a defense attorney can turn a case the way that the media or Hollywood makes it out? Because let me preface that one more time. Whether it's the Casey Anthony trial or O.J. Simpson, the impression was these defense attorneys, whether it's Johnny Cochran or F. Lee Bailey or Robert Shapiro, that they got O.J. off and that he probably would have gotten convicted if not for their skill as defense attorneys. Do you think and so I'm not speaking about any particular trial, but do you think a good defense attorney can really have power for their client in a way that's different than other defense attorneys?
Yes, but I really have to be careful, and I need a little time to explain this.
Okay.
So if you have the resources to hire a very experienced, skilled defense attorney...
Resources, you mean finances?
Money.
Finances, okay.
Who can pay a lot of attention to every facet of your case.
Both practical...
legal,
practical,
procedural,
okay.
So that lawyer can say, in essence, this is all I've got right now. And that lawyer has experience dealing with the prosecutor's office and knows how the courtroom operates and kind of knows how the judge presides. Then and can focus on that case alone. That can make a real difference when you compare it to a public defender who has 150 of those cases, not the resources, not the time, and is doing incredible work. And in some ways, they're the better angels of our society because they're doing this work. They're not paid very much. Their clients give them a hard time. They have a crushing caseload, and they work sometimes day and night to do the best job for their client, and might achieve as good or better results than the attorney who has one case if that attorney were given 150 cases. And so, yes, I think if you have resources, I don't know that you'll get an acquittal like O.J. Simpson got. You might. But what you might get are the charges reduced, or you might have that lawyer be able to convince the prosecutor, really my client doesn't deserve as much prison time as you think, or deserves probation, or give them a second chance. I've sent them to counseling. Here's a psychological report. I've worked with my client at length, and so I think you can achieve an outcome. And so I think that can happen. I can tell you that some of the public defenders who appeared in front of me are some of the best trial lawyers I've seen, but they have these kind of crushing caseloads. And they have clients who don't appreciate sometimes what they're doing. I want a real lawyer. And I go, well, you have a real lawyer. No, I have a public pretender or public defender. And I go, that's a real lawyer.
So this is interesting. I had never thought of it this way until right now. What you're saying is it's not that F. Lee Bailey, Johnny Cochran, Robert Shapiro, or any high-powered defense attorney is better than the public defender that someone maybe who doesn't have the resources would have. What you're saying is if you have a team of good lawyers who are watching every part of the trial, who are doing research, who are procedurally combing through the case at every level, in the volume of that work, you have so many more chances for it to go your direction.
Well, I'm saying that in part. That's part of what I'm saying. I quickly want to add, yeah, there are some lawyers who are such skilled orators and so convincing that they can get a jury to see the case their way and create.
So that is real at times.
Yeah, and
the Chicago
raise reasonable
example.
doubt.
And I know that's a drama.
But the point being that yes, there are some attorneys who are so skilled in people skills and presentation skills that they can raise a reasonable doubt in the juror's mind as to their client's guilt or innocence, and a reasonable doubt should result in acquittal. And there are some prosecutors who are great orators too, who give great closing arguments, and so the skill set of the lawyer, it does matter.
Who are some of the best you've ever seen? Whether
locally,
just
you
anywhere.
Want me to name names?
No, I'm just. And again, not in any particular trial, but who are some of just the best you've ever seen? If you had to,
I don't. That's a little. I mean, I know.
Tough question.
I know local people. I don't know if you want.
What about nationally? What nationally?
I mean, I thought Johnny Cochran was very articulate.
Yeah, not locally, but nationally.
F. Lee Bailey was, in his heyday, a really great lawyer. And then I've read novels about lawyers who were innovators, in closing argument. Kind of, we take things for granted now, but they did things that were unheard of, like demonstrative evidence, like using a skeleton for the first time and picking apart scientific evidence. So, I mean, this is kind of interesting. I'm going to brag a little bit. So we have a brand new judge in our court, Jeff Ashton. He was the prosecutor in the Casey Anthony case. I don't know how many Americans really know this, but I know this. Jeff Ashton was the first lawyer in America to introduce DNA into evidence. So there was...
Ever.
So there was courts before DNA, there was Jeff's case, DNA afterwards.
Is that right when the science had kind of caught up to where it was valid?
So I'll tell you about this case. Tommy Lee Andrews was an accused rapist, and his MO was he would pretty quickly cost women and blindfold them. So he'd come up from behind them and he'd blindfold them, then he'd rape them. And so it was very hard to get a conviction because no one could identify him. So, I mean, in a way, smart, if you're going to be a rapist, a smart way to do it, you can't identify me. You could get semen and you could get a blood type, but blood types are pretty broad. And so Jeff was reading a magazine at the state attorney's office about a doctor in England who testified in a paternity suit in England and said, this child is the child of this man because I ran this child's DNA and this DNA matched the father's DNA. And he read this whole article. What DNA? What are you talking about?
This is the 90s?
This was in the 80s.
In the 80s, okay.
And so he calls him up and he said, would you, if I flew you to America, would you come? He said, I've been waiting for someone to call me about a criminal case, so you bet. His name was Dr. Jeffries. So Jeff Ashton flew Dr. Jeffries to Orlando Judge Ron Powell held the hearing about, can this new science, DNA, be admitted into courts? And Dr. Jeffries testified, and the judge said, yeah, I'm going to let this into evidence. And Tommy Lee Andrews was convicted based on a DNA profile. His semen DNA profile matched the blood draw, and that changed the course of cases in America. I mean, now DNA
The
it's on
most
TV shows.
prominent evidence that you can have, right?
It's pretty good stuff. I mean, it gets attacked a little bit by the defense, but it's now jurors are going, well, where's the DNA?
And it also it exonerated or convicted thousands and thousands
Well,
and
that's
thousands.
another good point, because DNA can also exonerate falsely convicted people. It's sad. It's a sad statement that there are falsely convicted people in America, but it's not a perfect judicial system, and it can exonerate people. So it's an amazing science.
Yep, I know you have to be careful, and I'm very careful with the chief judge that he's currently the chief judge, and so I don't want to press him to give an opinion that he could get in a little trouble. But I would say, my qualm with the death penalty is just kind of that it's imperfect, that death is so certain, and at times, we don't have an exact. I think there's two arguments against the death penalty. One, it's not always right. We find out later that many people didn't commit the crimes that they're accused of. And number two, I think a question about the death penalty is, does a society that says it is civilized put people to death? But at least on one of those arguments, DNA became a stronger way to tie someone potentially to a crime. So DNA in that regard was a big part of probably death sentences in places where that's still legal.
Well, I'm going to go back to something I said earlier.
Okay.
So I'm not a policymaker, and I became a judge. I took an oath to apply the law,
Whatever it is.
And so what I've talked to my colleagues about is, I think before you certainly become a circuit judge in Florida, you have to think carefully about, could I impose the death penalty even if I'm opposed to it? And you have to answer that question, I think, in order to be a judge, to say, I'm going to apply the law. And I'm not going to express my personal opinion about the death penalty. I'm sure you can appreciate that. But I can say this. If I were king, or if I controlled the legislature, I might either pass some laws we don't have, or strike some laws that we do have. And so as a judge, I'm called upon every now and then to apply a law that I wouldn't pass if I were king, but I'm not king.
Yep.
I'm a judge. I took an oath to administer the law that the legislature passes. You can vote legislators out of office faster than you can vote me out of office, because I only run every 6 years. They run about every 2. And you can also directly lobby a legislator to say, change this law. And so my lane is, I apply the law as the legislature writes it, and it's not my job to say, you know what, I like that law, I'm going to apply that. I don't like that law, so I'm going to give you a pass on that. And that would be problematic for me, for judges who do that.
You need to become a state senator if you want to change laws.
Exactly right. And I've said to some of my colleagues occasionally, that's a brilliant, great argument. If you really believe it, you should leave the bench and run for the legislature, just to remind them, like, you got to stay in your lane. And that's a topic of a lot of debate, in a lot of political and apolitical circles.
And in that same spirit, I know you're limited on how you can comment on this, but kind of going back a little bit to the amount of people in our jails across America who have been convicted of drug offenses, and a lot of them, you still have seen a lot of folks convicted of cannabis, of marijuana. You still see some of those. You see that we've had a lot of folks go through our criminal justice system over the past couple decades, marijuana still being a charge that can put them in jail. You have to ask yourself whether incarceration, conviction that really ruins someone's life. You get convicted of a felony, boy, I don't want to use hyperbole here, but it's hard to come back from that, in my opinion. If you have a felony in America on your record, I think it's pretty hard to continue and be successful.
Yeah, if you're a convicted felon in Florida, you lose your right to vote. You can't serve on a jury. You can't get bonded.
You have to check a box that says I'm a felon many times.
Can't vote. And we just passed an amendment about, once you've fully served your sentence, completely served your sentence, you're voting rights can be restored. But before we pass that, you become a convicted felon in Florida. You cannot vote. You cannot serve on a jury. You cannot be bonded. There are many professions that if you're honest with them, you will never be a lawyer. Well, you might, but it's very hard to become a lawyer.
It's on your criminal record.
Probably not going to become a doctor. You're probably not going to be a nurse. And bonded, insured kind of jobs you're not going to do. Lots of, accountants who probably won't hire you because you deal with other people's money. So, and as you know, it affects your ability to get housing, public housing. It affects your ability to get public benefits very often. So, yeah, there are significant collateral direct consequences. You can go to prison. Collateral consequences for the rest of your life. You're dealing with these items, the stigma and these items. And so the debate is, who should we do that to? Andrae, I can't remember the last time I saw someone go to jail for a small amount of marijuana. It probably happens. I just haven't seen it much.
So what was that more prevalent 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Okay.
Yeah,
so
without question.
Okay, so our laws on marijuana have become softer. We have evolved. And again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but we've evolved.
I think as a matter of public policy, a lot of legislators have changed the position for mandatory sentences for marijuana, and not only that, but some judges have changed their attitude about, I have discretion here, and I'm going to exercise my discretion to go towards probation or drug counseling or community service or a fine rather than imprison someone for marijuana possession. Right now in Florida, you can receive a prescription for marijuana, and so that's going to be interesting about the whole search and seizure law, and does that change because of that? And Colorado, you can go just possess marijuana. It's not a crime. It's like alcohol or tobacco. It has deleterious effects on your health, but who are we to tell you that you can't drink or smoke marijuana?
I think this is where the war on drugs in America, that we have to have a big conversation. When you simply tell a society that here's all these drugs, don't do any of them, don't touch any of them, stay away from them, and if you do, we're going to enforce the law not equally, but somewhat equally, in as much as your life is going to be adversely affected in ways that are catastrophic. And if you become addicted to any of these drugs, quite honestly, there's going to be very little help for you and a lot of judgment and a lot of legal challenges you'll face. The idea that just say no to drugs, I don't know that worked in America, Judge.
I don't think it worked, okay. or we wouldn't have people who have the problem that they have to. Now, drugs. I mean, certain drugs. I don't know about marijuana. I think the literature's all over the place about its addictive qualities. Its dangerous qualities. I mean, right now there's some literature that has beneficial qualities for certain things.
For the first time, yeah.
But then there are some other drugs that just pretty clearly have deleterious effects on your life and are bad for your health, and so. But the debate I've heard my whole life growing up is alcohol is legal, tobacco is legal. We have alcoholics in America. We have people dying from lung cancer. Why is marijuana prescribed? And that's a debate kind of worth having.
I've seen people in my own family who alcohol ruined their life. Ruined alcohol 100% ruined my father's life. He had a lot of challenges.
Sorry to hear that.
He had a lot of challenges growing up, but alcohol became this addictive force that, from as long as I knew him as a kid to when he passed away, alcohol ruined his life. I would say that I hear from many folks, alcohol is every bit as addictive or more addictive than many of the drugs that are illegal. So
so there's that debate. I mean, the phenomena in my life was not so much alcohol, but my dad went into the military in World War II, and the U.S. Army gave him supplies, and the biggest supply that they got were cartons and cartons of cigarettes. And he said he never smoked till he went in. He was an athlete, never smoked till he went into the military, but he came out completely addicted to cigarettes, smoked the rest of his life, died from heart-lung disease.
Wow.
In his late 60s, which is young for when he died. And, at the time, the military thought, this is what, the enlisted folks want. They want cigarettes, so they gave him cigarettes. And although there's now some literature about the tobacco companies were just giving it away for free because they knew that it kind of had an addictive tendency, and so then all these sailors, soldiers, all of our veterans would be addicted to their product and buy it when they got home. So I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to tell you about two areas that I think are hot topics in criminal justice reform. There's a nationwide debate about pretrial release, Andrae. There are more people in the local jail here, and this might be true in all locales, there are more people in that jail who have not been sentenced for a crime than there are people serving a sentence.
Say that one more time.
There are more people.
The average person out there will not believe this.
I'll repeat this. There are more people in Orange County Jail who have not been sentenced for a crime, for the crime that is keeping them in the jail, than there are people who are sentenced.
I think we looked at this. We saw a slide. We didn't validate it, but there were.
Well, I know it's true for the Orange County Jail.
So it has. So it's probably true at some level around America.
Probably is.
And so people have been arrested. They've been charged with the crime, but they haven't been convicted.
Correct.
They are not convicted of any crime, but yet they sit in jail.
And that is because for decades now we have been driven by monetary bail bond. Like, you can get out of jail if you post money bond. And a whole industry has grown up, the bail bonds industry, where you pay a bondsman or woman 10% of the principal. So on a $2,500 bond, $250.
What is the logic behind that?
Well, it grew out of, if you go back in time, this all started in Great Britain. And if you want a quick history lesson, the judges would ride around a circuit. And this was all territory controlled by the king. And the king would name a sheriff. And the sheriff would go out and arrest Andrae for stealing someone else's cow or cows. And they'd put you in jail. And they would keep you in jail till the judge got there. And sometimes that would take months. And the feudal lords went to the king and said, we can't produce the kind of crops or livestock that you're demanding, that you're taxing us on, because you're keeping our people in jail, so you need to let them out. And they came up with a system of how can we let people out until the judge who's riding the circuit gets there to hear their case. And they went through all kinds of, how do we deal with this? And they came up with a couple of schemes. One was, if a family member said, I promise I'll get Andrae at his trial, and Andrae didn't show up, that person would serve the sentence if Andrae were convicted.
Pretty smart.
So that was a motive to make sure that, your brother, sister showed up for trial. And after a while, that sort of guarantee of appearance for your trial evolved into, well, what if we just gave you money, and so you could keep money if the person didn't show up. And that took hold in Great Britain. When our country was founded, one of the complaints was that in Great Britain and then in the colonies, the courts were imposing excessive bail to keep people in jail who they wanted to stay in jail. And so one of our constitutional protections is that excessive bail in America violates our Constitution, the Eighth Amendment. So you can't say...
Who's to say what excessive is?
Well, so an example would be, let's say I know your financial situation, you got arrested, and it's like, well, you're entitled to bail, but I'll just set it at $2 million. And it's like, well, that's ridiculous. I can never post a $2 million bond. I can post a $2,000 bond. And so it's illegal to set excessive bail on cases, but not monetary bail. But what we've learned over the last 10 years or so, Andrae, is that maybe we should look at releasing people back into the community who have been arrested based on their risk to the community. And so if you pose low risk and you don't need a lot of services, and it's pretty certain that you're going to show up for your trial, just get you out of the jail.
Yeah, take the money part out of it.
Take the money part out of it.
Because that's
release you.
Disproportionately affecting people who are in poverty.
Because here's an example. So let's say you have money and you go and you commit an aggravated battery, you injure someone, and the bond's $5,000, and you got $5,000. You just post your bond. You don't even see me. You just get out of jail within 12 hours.
Swipe your credit card.
Let's say you commit a petty theft or a grand theft, and your bond's $500 or $1,000, and you go, I don't have $500 or $1,000. Or you're homeless, and you say your bond is $500, and the homeless person says, Judge, if I had $500, I wouldn't be here in front of you. I wouldn't have been sleeping in a public park and arrested for loitering. So we keep those people in jail. They don't present.
They have to stay in jail because they didn't
have
present.
to stay in jail under a monetary bond system if we don't release them ROR or PTR. pretrial release systems. And so there's this big conversation, really it's nationwide, about is that system that we used forever, are we just finally waking up and going, that is discriminatory when it comes to poor or indigent people?
It is fascinating that it's 2019. I mean this very sincerely.
No, it is.
And that conversation hundreds of years later is now happening.
In fairness, there were some voices, in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s that said this is wrong, but they were in the wilderness, and now more people are saying this is just not a fair system for releasing people.
We tied two things together, it sounds like. The idea that money is a form of bonding someone, and the idea that certain people are a danger or a flight risk. So what we did is we married those two things together, and we've been trying to unravel them.
Yeah,
Is that kind of...
now the big movement is sort of, are there instruments, scientifically valid instruments, that can assess the risk that a person presents? And that's debatable, but many jurisdictions...
If they're charged with murder.
Well, yeah, not too many...
A violent crime.
Yeah, there are certain crimes you're probably not going to get out of jail for. Murder in Florida, capital crime, where
you're not getting out.
Well, the proof has to be evident, the presumption great, which means there's a lot of evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to hold you without bond. But let's say you don't have that, you still get bond in a murder. It's probably going to be fairly significant to ensure that you appear, because if you get convicted, you're spending the rest of your life in prison, so there's a big motive to flee. And so that's where you see certain high bonds. But my example is, so you get arrested for petty theft or grand theft, you don't have $500 or $1,000, you stay in jail till your trial, 90 days, 180 days, 365 days later. The person who committed aggravated battery posted bond, they're out the whole time. We know statistically that your defense is probably a little better. You're more prepared if you're out rather than in the jail awaiting trial, more visits with your lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. Some people will plea saying, I've been in here for 6 months, I didn't do this, but they'll let me out if I just say I'm guilty or plead no contest because I've already done 6 months, so I'll plea. So you get that. So that's a big debate. And then the other debate is sentencing guidelines. Are they discriminatory in any factor? And court costs, fines, and fees. So those are imposed almost in every case. But much like bond, if you're Bill Gates and I impose a $10,000 fine, you're writing a check. You're done. If you're most people that I see in court and I impose a $1,000 fine and court costs, it's going to take me years and years to pay that.
And you have to, under the current system, impose...
There are mandatory court costs that I have to impose and I can't waive. There's a lot of discretionary costs, but mandatory court costs. And that gets people in a trap. They lose their license if they don't pay after a certain period of time. So now they're either not driving or driving on a suspended license. That ends them back up in the criminal system. The clerk of the court can try to collect that money or send it to a collection agent who can charge 40%. Imagine a credit card that charged you 40% on your principal. And so 40% on $1,000 for someone who can barely pay rent, all of a sudden, well, you owe $1,400. Okay, here's $200, paid that towards my principal. No. That goes to our interest payment, the 40% we, the collection agency, get to collect, charge to collect. We get that first before we even get to your principal. And so it's this insidious, never-ending legal financial obligation. I just can't get out from under it. And that's problematic in our system. On the other hand, it is common to say you're going to pay something for your crime. Not just, spending the night in jail or being on probation, but pay the costs that the system incurs to prosecute you for your wrongdoing. So that's a big conversation.
Okay.
Difficult problem to solve. How do you solve it fairly to all people and don't discriminate one way or the other? You don't let everybody off without paying fines except for the very wealthy. Where do you draw the line? So that's an interesting.
Yeah, it seems that they should be able to use statistical probability like in everything else.
Well, one thing, you cannot imprison someone in America on a debt. So you can't say, well, you can't pay your court costs, now you're going to jail.
That's interesting.
You cannot imprison
You could
people.
be imprisoned in Great Britain before we came here.
Yes, but that was another founding father's principle.
You cannot be imprisoned for
your debt. So you can declare bankruptcy, but also in the court system, we can't say, I ordered you to pay $1,000. I know you don't have the ability to pay it, so I'll just put you in jail. You can't do that. You have to find, you didn't pay this, and I know you had the ability to pay it before I can say, go to jail now. The only sort of exception for that is sometimes a little bit in the child support area. But even there, when a civil judge says, I ordered you to pay child support, and you're just not paying it, the court has to find that you had the ability to pay. And then oftentimes will say, you're refusing to pay because you're so angry at your spouse or mad about this divorce, but I know you have the ability to pay, so you're going to go to jail till you pay.
Gotcha. Judge, push that back in your ear.
But even that is, you have to have the ability to pay before.
Perfect. You got 5 minutes left. What was the second thing you wanted to talk about?
Well, I think I covered it. So it was pretrial
Okay.
release, and then court costs, fines, and fees.
Gotcha.
And then, I think this conversation that we started off with about, disproportionate representation in the prison population is very important. And the other one that I think merits some conversation is, what does the bench look like in my county or anywhere in America when you walk into a courtroom?
What does it look like statistically?
Well, I'm proud to say that in my circuit, there are more women than men on the bench.
That's very interesting. I don't think people would know that.
So we have more women on the bench in Orange County and the Ninth Circuit than men. It's very close. It's like 50.1% women, 49.9% men. But we have gender equality. What we don't have is ethnic representation based in any way close to the proportion of minorities in our community.
Is that around America? Probably it's probably pretty similar.
I wish I knew the American stats, but
Okay.
I can talk about my local experience. So we are underrepresented by African Americans and Hispanics on the bench in a community that has a significant African American and Hispanic population, and I think that it is important that all members of the community, whatever neighborhood you live in, go to the court system and say, maybe I'm not lucky enough to get that judge, but that judge, understands sort of my community and where I grew up and how I grew up, and I think that that's important for people.
I think that's a tough thing to change. Let me just say why I believe that. So I think about you as the chief judge, or I think about some of the other judges I know here in our community or judges I've known around America in other communities. These are folks that somehow, I'm not sure everyone has a different starting point, but somehow they got on a pathway where they got out of high school, went to college, and then went to law school, became an attorney. All of those things are very tough, and often without the support of someone around you is not something you're going to be able to do, on your own. And then they wind up in a place in society where they can either be appointed or run for office. I think what I'm alluding to is this idea in our society, I'm being really broad, I'm painting with a broad brush here,
Okay.
that the guy who just comes out of a bad neighborhood, or the guy or gal who has a very challenging upbringing, and someone who has a better opportunity, whether it's socioeconomics by itself or parents that pour into them. I just think that pathway for people who have challenges, a lot of minorities, with poverty, to the place where they could become a judge, just practically speaking, I think those people might have a much tougher road, and I think a lot of people dismiss that. How do we balance those scales? Pardon the pun.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. I think
You get my point, though, that the journey, I don't think you can just dismiss, I don't think we as a society can dismiss that. I've heard it said this way before, that we expect everyone to hit a home run, but some people are born on third base.
Yeah, that's right.
You've heard that many times
Right,
before.
right.
In
There's
your situation, I mean, you're a guy that has worked hard for everything in your life, but boy, there are people that start, especially a lot of our minority groups in this country, they just have a lot more challenges. Not making excuses, but
no, that's true. But I want to offer this perspective. So my predecessor, Belvin Perry, his father was the first or second. I keep forgetting if he was number one or he was number two. African American Orlando police officer.
wow.
Belvin went to Jones High School at the time, predominantly, if not exclusively, African American. Became a state attorney, was a phenomenal trial lawyer, became a great trial judge, became chief judge. And his perspective in our court system was just invaluable. But also, when Belvin went out into our community, certain communities just swelled with pride, like, that's our chief judge. And, it's funny. I mean, Belvin's perspective was amazing. Sometimes he was more liberal on a topic than I thought he would be, and oftentimes he was much more conservative. So, it wasn't like, oh, there's this stereotypical, we know where Belvin's going to come down on issues. But it was very, I think, helpful for our court to have him as a judge and then eventually to have him as a leader of our court system. And I think it spoke well of our community. He wasn't the first African-American chief judge. Emerson Thompson was. But their perspective on the court was very helpful to us. And my point is just, I think we would be a weaker court without someone like Emerson Thompson
Gotcha.
or Belvin Perry. And I think it's just beneficial for us to have that voice and for the community to look at our court system and say, Belvin Perry came from my neighborhood and he's the chief judge of the Ninth Judicial Circuit. And so I think that adds value, and that's the point I'm trying to make. And I think it's an issue, for our bench across the United States. What do we look like? It's a conversation that will continue, I'm sure.
You're wrapping up your role as chief judge in a few months.
End of June.
End of June. You've had a long career as a judge, as an attorney. What are 3 big lessons? I'm just kind of throwing this random out there that if you were reflecting on a career in the criminal justice system, and you have people in front of you had a crowd in front of you. What are 3 big lessons that you take away from that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrae. One is, I don't know that we teach the skill of listening to our students or anybody in America. So you don't go to class and take a skill, take a class, you don't go to school and take a class on listening skills very much. Maybe that's starting to change a little bit. As a judge, what I've learned is you better keep listening, because just when you think you understand something or you've heard one side of the story, you hear the other side and it's like, whoa, there's more to this than I realized. And active listening is very hard. It can be very tiring. It's an under-taught, underappreciated skill, but you have to listen carefully in my business. Both lawyers and judges, I think, have to have empathy for other people. If you don't have empathy for other human beings, I don't think you're going to be a very good lawyer, and I don't think you'll succeed as a judge. That doesn't mean you have to let everybody go because you feel sorry for them. But I think it is critical and essential that a judge respect the human dignity of everybody who comes in front of them, no matter what they're accused of doing. And so even the most horrendous accusation, that individual is a human being. We are a country where people fought and died to protect basic rights. That includes the right to counsel, the right to be presumed innocent, to require a jury to convict you beyond a reasonable doubt, and for you to be afforded the process that everyone else in America is afforded. There are examples in our history, nearby examples like Groveland, where that was grossly dishonored as opposed to honored, and then the results were tragic and terrible. And so I think it's important that lawyers and judges realize that this is a human being protected by the same rights as every other human being. And then finally, I was blessed, and we were all blessed, really to be born into a country where, with all of its faults, and we have tremendous faults, but with all of our faults, I think the good far outweighs the bad. So we were born into a democracy. We have income that is disproportionate, but if you travel overseas and you look at sort of the poverty and the caste system in certain cultures, you realize in America, yes, we have challenges, but we also have enormous opportunities and enormous blessings, and we tend to look out for each other. I mean, we get divided at times, but we tend to look out for each other. And it was just by the grace of God that I was born in America as opposed to Soviet Russia or North Korea, these horribly oppressive totalitarian societies. And so I don't ever want to lose sight of the fact that I'm really blessed. I was raised, as I know you were, and was taught by people I love that it is important to give back to a society that gives so much to you. And our society has given me so many blessings to be chief judge. I never thought that would happen. And so my responsibility is to give back to the community whatever skills, talents, attention, energy I have to sort of repay a debt I know I can never repay. And that is to be thankful and involved in the community that's given me so much.
Chief Judge Fred Lauten, our guest today on Change Everything Live with me, Andrae Bailey. If you missed part of this broadcast because of watching it on CBS, you can watch the full interview on YouTube Live and on Apple iTunes. Judge,
Great,
as always.
Thanks. Enjoy talking to you.
Talk to you
so
soon,
much.
and we'll see you next week.